Okay, Johnny, do you see the lack of flexibility from employers as a major driver for disinterest to employment in those companies in Ireland? Any statistics on this?
We surveyed 500 talent and HR leaders earlier this year on the impact of flexibility, and 69% of them said that flexibility was the number one driver for lack of engagement and people leaving, but also for attracting talent. So I think the organizations that have brought more flexibility into their hiring and their work practices, and that doesn't mean you have to be 5 days flexible, just certainty around flexibility. They're winning the war, they're attracting better talent, and they're also retaining that talent.
Perfect. Any comments on the high inflation and low unemployment paradox?
This is a unique time where we have high inflation and low unemployment. Will it last? I think it won't go back to where it has been in previous recessions, where we've had very high inflation and corresponding double-digit, unemployment rates. I think unemployment's going to go up. You see in the Czech Republic, it's inched up over the summer from 2.7, 2.8 to about 3.2. Still crazy low, but it is going in that direction. I don't think you're going to get to 12% unless something crazy happens with the war in Europe or we don't get a handle on inflation. So of course it could go in that direction. It could go crazy. Hopefully, though, inflation will begin to solve itself over the next 12 to 18 months. Unemployment may rise a slight bit, but the fundamental market dynamics where we just don't have enough skills in the market and there's a huge growth in those skills, I don't mean just digital skills, all types of skills, will mean that recruiting will remain difficult for the next couple of years.
About the gig economy. With the gig economy and hiring people to get the job done rather than hiring from them for a career, does it change the recruiter's approach to candidates? For example, shorter hiring process, less focus on long-term motivation, more focus on skills?
I'm not sure the gig economy, as it had been accelerating before the pandemic, will continue at the same pace. In fact, I've seen data that says that it's slowed right down, and we've seen a reversal in that trend towards multiple different employers working for oneself. Entrepreneurship became a big thing in the last 2 decades. That wasn't there 20 years ago, and it became a big cultural thing. That might be dying off as employees coming out of the pandemic look for more purpose and want a bit more security when there was so much insecurity. I find that when you're in a situation like we are at the moment with inflation and recession, when there's going to be more insecurity, I suspect people will want more security and there might be more of an interest in more stable jobs. I think outsourcing and working with different providers to provide talent will change that. And certainly the relationship will be different. So gig economy, if you expand that idea to perhaps looking at employees who are working flexible hours or less hours, but maybe on a more permanent contract. Yes, I think we have to be more flexible to accommodate different types of talents and their needs. But gig economy, as it was going in the early 20s, I think isn't quite the same as where it is going today, perhaps.
All right. You talk about Walmart and Disney upskilling their potential employees. We actually got a deployment project with Microsoft, which is more like upgrading people with the digital skills, basically to all citizens. Do you know a similar project around the world, which would be like focusing on digital skills and deployment?
About 5-6 years ago, I started working with the team in Cognizant in Europe, and they were talking to me about how they were hiring Java engineers at the time, but also Salesforce engineers. And they realized there weren't enough folks in the market, and Cognizant weren't the highest paying employer in that area. And so they pushed back on the business to say, we need to create talent. And they identified 2 to 3 core skills that were essential to be a successful Java engineer. And they built a boot camp that lasted 90 days using different online sources of learning and some internal learning to basically take folks who had the basic fundamentals, good quantitative skills, flexibility, etc., good attitude to work. And they trained them to be, after 90 days, Java engineers that could be put on client site. And they took that model and they scaled it out to their Salesforce engineers and other skills within the business on scale. So that was my first example of recruiting teams really looking at the problem from how do you create the skills. So when I heard GoodCall were doing this with Microsoft, I was so impressed because it's really getting to the core of what the customer wants. They want the talent. They don't just need you to move talent around. If you're creating net new talent for them, I think that's the future.
Totally. Do you believe that the idea of that hiring is everyone's job should start from the top, like from the CEO?
100%. You can be bottom up with these things, but it's very difficult to get the buy-in. Fundamentally, you'll have a hiring manager saying, listen, recruiter, just go do the work for me. Whereas if you have your CEO and her colleagues all saying, I want to get involved, I'm doing training on how to be better at interviewing, better at recruiting, I want to get involved and hear from the recruiting team, I want to input into this because my job is also to hire. My LinkedIn profile matters to future employees, so I'm going to work with my recruiting colleagues to help them or help us bring in the talent. I think it does need to be from the top for sure. I've seen attempts to make it successful with just the recruiting leadership buying into it. You need the entire business. The head of engineering, for example, she needs to say, this is how we hire now, and we're all responsible. Otherwise, her team aren't going to buy into it.
Vodafone Czech Republic actually announced a year ago that all roles are now available part-time, including management positions. What's your view on this? Is it a good way to get parents coming back from parental leave? Can organization afford to have part-time leaders?
I met with a customer of mine in Amsterdam 3 weeks ago, and she shared with me that in the Netherlands, half the population, half the working population work part-time. I was stunned by this. I didn't know this. Now, part-time, it's mainly a 4-day week. In the Netherlands, Dutch culture is that you work to live. You don't live to work. And most people end up having some sort of flexible arrangement around the amount of days they work. So I think this is absolutely the future, and it's obviously happening in many parts of Europe today, Netherlands being perhaps the prime example. So I do think that flexibility is important. I think the idea of having a job done by different people, this exists today, it's called teams, right? So we have jobs that need to be done by multiple people, and how different is it to have 2 different people who maybe work 2.5 days a week each contribute to that? It's the same idea as 5 people in a team working towards a team objective. It's just 10 people now. It's spread across 2.5 days of work each. I think it opens up huge pockets of the economy that otherwise were locked out of the workforce, because people think part-time is about the job not being important enough. If we just think about people sharing the work to get it done more like a team and having more part-time work, I think it's a fabulous idea.
How important is employer branding for a recruiter success from your perspective?
If you've never heard of a company and a sourcer or a recruiter reaches out to you, it's very difficult to get your attention. If that is a big brand, a consumer brand that you love, you buy every day, you wear the t-shirts, you're going to be up for a call. So at a basic level, consumer brands always have it easier, right? Even if they have no employer brand, their consumer brand carries it. So when I hear of companies like Apple and Google and Nike and what they do to recruit, I'm thinking, yeah, but it's easy because you've got a great consumer brand. What I love to hear about is organizations that no one's heard of, B2B organizations particularly, who have great hiring success because it's hard for them. So employer brand's really important, but the employer branding of the 2020s is much more driven by the people in an organization and less by big ad agencies who build campaigns and produce beautifully polished videos. What employees or future employees are looking for is authenticity and honest opinions of the company. So the organizations who are driving an employer branding strategy that leverages the entire workforce, that turns everybody into a potential employer brand advocate. The advocacy is really important. So you're empowering your people to share their work experiences online, maybe giving them a common hashtag so it can come together. You're not forcing them to say good things, but what will happen is if you've got a good organization, your employees will say good things. And as long as you direct candidates to that, they'll find out what organically people are saying by themselves. And that's the really it's a really powerful way of doing employer branding.
Will the TA function finally move out from under HR and its own area, reporting into board or leadership directly?
I don't like the phrase human resources, and most people in the people space don't like it either. It just, human resources, oh, it sounds horrible. But in the people space, I see talent acquisition as part of talent breaking out from the traditional HR team, and HR being a lot more of the administrative process systems side being left as a team, and then there being a VP of talent. I don't think there'd be a VP of talent acquisition or a chief talent acquisition officer. I think that's wrong. There should be a chief talent officer perhaps. But then the question is, well, what's the chief people officer? What are they doing? It doesn't really matter, whether it all becomes a different department or not. To me, the question is, does the person in charge of people at a board level have the same power as the CFO, as the CMO, as the CIO. And I think that has happened post-pandemic. Organizations realize, hang on a second, talent are everything to our success. Our innovation, our creativity, getting work done, growing in new markets. So talent is driving the strategy these days. What the job title is, doesn't bother me at all. Whether it's in HR or not, doesn't bother me at all. The fact is that talent is now driving the strategy, not just having a seat at the table.
Your comments about different focused recruiters for the candidate side and for the business side is spot on. However, do you see enough companies ready to invest in this?
There's a certain level of scale you have to reach to justify having candidate-facing recruiters and client or business-facing recruiters. But it can start as at maybe 4 people. It can be as small as that, right? I think you see this in smart teams where you have somebody who sources, somebody who maybe recruits. On scale, though, there's so much more efficiency here. And it allows you to move away from a model where you have a rec-based sourcing. Rec-based sourcing, I still think, is killing the sourcing industry, where you wait for a rec to open, the sourcer starts sourcing, the recruiter waits for the shortlist and moves on, as opposed to an ever sourcing team that work on profiles of people that we constantly hire for. We're always producing great talent into your database, and then recruiters can jump in quickly and leverage the talent pools that are built in the database, the CRM for those. That's what you see on scale. You need to have maybe 10 people in your recruiting team overall, maybe, for that to happen. But it can be done even as little as 4. It's definitely the direction to go. You have to be practical about how big is your team. If you're hiring 50 people a year, maybe you don't need this just yet. But what you can do is use an outsource provider. So what I see is that organizations that don't yet have this size of team, they'll handle the in-house business-facing part themselves with their recruiters, and they'll outsource to another organization who are brilliant to the talent market. So even if you don't hire that many people, you can leverage an RPO or an outsourced recruiting provider who have that candidate expertise. They don't really need to know your business inside out. You can do that. Keep your own people on that side, but use the expertise of a candidate or market-facing RPO to bring that to your organization.
What are the most popular courses on social talent these days? Does it already reflect the more strategic approach to talent acquisition globally?
Previously, most popular courses were sourcing courses, practical recruiting courses, recruitment SEO, these kind of things. We've seen that a big change in the last few years. In recruiters, it's almost always how to be a talent advisor at all different levels. How do I build up my advisory skills, my influence skills with hiring managers, with other stakeholders? That's the key skill that most teams are looking to develop. And it's a never-ending skill you need to keep developing, and a muscle you need to keep flexing. And then on scale, we see interview training across the entire organization as being hugely popular. There's been a big move towards this the last couple of years. As teams mature and they realize it's not good enough just to make your recruiters talented, you need to make the rest of the business nearly as good as your recruiters if you're going to be able to hire as an organization. So there's a lot of change there, and I see that changing in the future towards the talent advisors or talent acquisition advisors, as they are today, genuinely become talent advisors, understanding a lot more about how you hire from diverse, different populations, be more inclusive in your hiring processes as well. We've seen that training, of course, explode in the last couple of years. But how do I really understand more about my business, and how can I provide more solutions to the organization? I see that's the direction we're going in.
Thank you very much, Johnny, for your answers, and thank you that you come to Prague actually to our RPO event.
Always a pleasure to be here in Prague, and thanks, Jose, for having me.